Hello everyone, and welcome to your Masters in Management. My name's Sandy, and today we'll be discussing evidence-based management. Today we're here with Dr. De Bono, who's not just a practitioner in the field, he's also an academic, so he'll be here to share his expertise on the topic. Dr. De Bono, thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
So my first question is, what is evidence-based management, and how can we apply it to the workplace?
Very good. Evidence-based management is rather a new science in the field of management. Actually, it started in the field of medicine, eventually moved into other fields, and undoubtedly today it is also practiced in the field of management. A lot of people actually ask this very basic question: what is evidence-based management? When we were discussing with students, the list of topics that they were going to study, and if you discuss it as well with a number of entrepreneurs and business owners, and you tell them, you need to have evidence-based decision making, they look at you and they say, what are you actually talking about? What are you saying? The word evidence-based literally is made up of one fundamental issue, that you need to have scientific data in order to move forward. So far, we know that a lot of people, particularly in the management field, but it could also be in other areas, where they've made decisions based on a number of issues which were not necessarily studied before. Evidence-based management is therefore the application of scientific data which can be gathered through different phases of the business processes, and through that, therefore, one can have enough information to be able to make the necessary decisions at a later point in time or at that particular point in time. Gone are those days when a lot of decisions were made on gut feeling. Gone are those days when a lot of decisions are made on what I think at that particular point in time or what I feel. Though the human aspect of feeling and thinking and the gut feeling will always be there, because at the end of the day we remain humans. But a lot of decisions taken from the medical field, in the financial field, in the banking sector, are actually taken on a series of algorithms, on a series of data set, on a series of based, proven scientific data collated together in a particular formula, which can then help you to decide. This actually emanates, although we're talking about evidence-based management as if it is a new science, even going back in the 1960s, in the 1970s, a lot of people, particularly in the management field, practiced one particular notion, that anything which cannot be measured cannot be managed. In fact, Charles Handy is one of the famous authors who is renowned of having said this, and a lot of other people actually quote him in actually saying this. So anything which cannot be measured cannot be managed. And the fact that the process, that a system, that an idea, that an outcome has to be measured, it means that then you can take the necessary steps. And one can cite a number of examples. Let me give you a very simple case. Imagine that you would have a telephone operator, and he or she would tell you that I receive a lot of calls every day. Your next question would be, what does a lot of calls actually mean? 10 calls, 20 calls, 100 calls, or 1,000 calls? That is evidence-based. Now, if this person spends 5 minutes on every call, then you know how many telephone calls, how many calls he or he is taking, and the average time spent on the phone. So with the data available, you can look into the business, you can look into the different areas of business. It is a known fact that gathering data is a headache. And a number of businesses today, they have gone to this particular step, so they have achieved the step of data gathering. But the issue now needs to move forward, because having data gathering, having data stored, having an archive of data sets does not mean anything at all. But what you do with that data set and the transition of that data set into information, knowledge, wisdom, as we'll discuss later on. But the essence of evidence-based management is therefore the application of scientific data and scientific way of gathering data in order to be able to use that particular data for eventual decision making at a particular point in time. Everyone needs to make decisions, Sandy. I mean, if you take different levels of the organization hierarchy, top management needs to make decisions. Functional managers are constantly there to make decisions. An employee working on his or her own in a particular location also needs to make decisions. So decision making, contrary to what people think, is not something which is reserved, which is only something which top management is involved in, but on the contrary, everybody is involved in decision making. Therefore, having the evidence, having the information, having scientific proven evidence which can help you to make better decisions is undoubtedly something which we cannot completely ignore in today's management field.
That's right. Okay, what are the best practices based on evidence in an organization?
When you say best practices, you can look into different sides of business. Because when you say a best practice where evidence-based is being practiced is too vague. So I would rather give it some parameters.
Okay.
Traditionally, the most evidence-based approach was practiced in finance. And it was practiced in finance because that was probably the only measurement that companies had over a long period of time, which is the money that you're investing, the return that you're getting out of money. At the end of the day, you've got the P&L and the balance sheet, which would give you how the business is doing over a period of time. So finance has its own measures, has its own evidence-based. That is understood by everyone. If you go and get a loan from a bank account, definitely, a bank loan, you definitely need to present your final accounts. If you, you need to invest, everybody's going to ask, or everyone is there to invest in your business, they're going to ask for your financial performance. So from the financial field, that evidence-based has always been there. But there are other management areas where evidence-based has not been something which is particularly been there for quite a long time. One of them, for example, is service delivery, or customer service delivery, to be even more precise, which can go as far as the satisfaction of the client, of the customer about a particular product or service, which can go about the time taken to actually meet the delivery of that particular service or product, which could mean the queuing time, which could mean, anything which is directly related to customers. Actually, what makes customer satisfaction at the end of the day? It is that the customer is happy with the service or with the product he or she is getting, but getting it at the right time and at the right price. So these are also evidence-based issues. Now, in order for a business to be able to meet that service delivery at the right price and at the right time, there needs to be evidence-based scientific research which is carried out before. I mean, today, even, for example, newspapers are constantly, in order to publish a good article in their newspapers, they do surveys, and they're constantly doing surveys. So even in journalism, for example, if you go one step at a tangent from management, but in order to publish a very good story, what do? They carry out a survey, and the results of the survey are usually, and that's the way they are, scientifically based data, and therefore they build their story on that particular scientifically based data. So wherever you look, even in the business endeavor, so there's the finance, there's the customer, there's the supplier. Who is the supplier who actually offers you the best price? Who is that supplier who offers you the best price at the right time? Who is that supplier who actually has the best supply chain in order to transfer the products from the warehouse to particularly your retail shop, within the adequate time? And you can measure that. So you can also make decisions on that delivery, on that, based on the service chain as it is. You can go, in IT. IT has become the backbone of evidence-based. So today, what do they tell you? Try and get all this data, manage this data, so that you can then transfer it. Evidence-based management today is becoming a culture, is becoming more of an organizational culture. And this has to be part of the organization values. Sometimes it is much easier to go to your boss, to go to your manager, to go to whoever, and you say the good things. But building an evidence-based culture is actually constantly measuring what is happening at different intervals. For example, if you plan to do in the service industry, let's say in our line of business, 100 hours on a project, but for some reason or another, you're doing 120 hours on the project, that is very important information which needs to be revealed. Why is that the case? Because next time round, if you need to quote for a similar project, provided that everything else is equal, because you could have taken more time, I don't know, because there were 2 new employees who were not completely competent on the process. So obviously you cannot load those 20 hours on the client, or you could have had an employee who found it extremely difficult to get the job done for different reasons. Again, you cannot load that extra hours on the client. But if everything else is equal and you've estimated that you need 100 hours, but the project actually took 120 hours, that is very critical information, because next time round, you know that in order to be able to carry out that project, you need a certain amount of hours in order to be able to complete that project according and in line with the customer's satisfaction. You can keep on going one example after another. It is very, very important to actually know that businesses today need to have evidence-based in every process, in every part, in every function, in every system. Failing to do that, managers and leaders and business owners would be in a very difficult position to actually identify the next strategic steps forward in order to meet the desired goals. For example, one of the evidence-based notions are customer requirements, customer demands in the future, in the near future, because for any business to thrive, one need to anticipate, one need to learn about what are going to be the customer demands in the next few months. You know, if summer is approaching, then, for example, the new customer demands, that's through evidence-based, you can prepare your menu of your restaurant or your set of drinks in a bar, or the hotel starts organizing certain other events because summer would be approaching, where there would be an influx of tourists. And again, what type of tourists? Adults, children, and from which continent are they coming? So in order to meet the customer demands, in order that the transition between the supplier and the customer and the organization in between is actually reached, the evidence is a must. It's no longer a luxury, but it has really become a must.
Okay. And what is considered a trustworthy source of evidence?
A trustworthy source of evidence could be, first of all, I tend to say scientific. If data is not scientifically gathered, then there is a problem. Wearing an academic hat, wearing a researcher hat, there is a flow how to gather data and how to gather scientific data, how to manage that data, what type of sampling you're getting, and how you're managing that sampling. How are you ensuring that there is, assurance that the sample which you are getting is not skewed? And what are you doing in order to manage that level of skewness, which could, if you're skewing the result, basically you're not having any scientific data at all. Scientific data also means not only in the way which you're gathering data, but even more so in the way which you are analyzing the data. The statistical test that you are using, the statistical analysis that you have used one test or another, the margin of error that you can accept, and so many other statistical interventions which are used from time to time, first to ensure that the data is reliable and valid, but mostly also to ensure that the outcome of that particular data can be significantly used in that particular instance, and if it is very reliable and valid, it has some sense of replicability in other areas as well. So the notion of having scientific data in the different phases, in the conceptualization of the scientific data, in the gathering of scientific data, in the analysis of the scientific data, and even more so in the presentation, because very often we leave this very final part out from the equation. the presentation of the data, it's like the delivery part. Because data needs to make sense to those who are actually reading it. If you have an audience who is not statistically oriented, and you're presenting the data in a form of statistical sets, and you want your employees to actually make heads and tails about it, then obviously they're not going to do so, unless you teach them, which is good to do so. But even more so, it's even more important to actually translate that data, which is in statistical measurements, into language which people can relate to. Because at the end of the day, what managers and leaders should actually try for is not only doing the work, but ensuring that the work is adequately communicated to the different levels. Yes. Otherwise than that, I mean, it would be a waste of time and waste of energy. Another source of data which is required are the hard facts data.
Okay.
And this is the actual data that companies do have. And it's amazing, you know, when you go around in different organizations, you would immediately realize that there's a lot of data which is residing very often, however, at different places. So if you take, I don't know, a hotel as an example, the reservations may have a set of data. If you go to finance, the finance may have a set of data. If you go, I don't know, to the food and beverage, the food and beverage may have a set of data. If you go to the inventory, to stores, there may be a set of data. Those are independent data sets. They're all hard facts. The potential ability of getting all these different points of data, all these different sources of data into one core valid outcome would also help the business to try forward. So having hard data sets, that's important. There are also some soft elements, which implies that there's people who can interpret those data sets, and therefore numbers would start having meaning, which is important. Another very important source that you need to have in order to ensure good information for your evidence-based are actually the stakeholders involved who's providing you with information. Now, this is a very tricky one, because you would say, who are the best stakeholders to be involved? When you say stakeholders, by definition, we are saying those people who are directly involved in a particular process at a particular point in time. Today, we're immediately using the concept of 360-degree stakeholder analysis, which means that if there is a process, you try to get information from the key points, from the key people in every part of the process. So starting from the supplier, going to the customer, and then go way back to the supplier, because that would first give you more comprehensive information. And secondly, it could also give you information which may not be completely the same. Sometimes different data sets, different data points do not converge. If it's converged, it's good. If it does not converge, it doesn't mean that it's not good. But at least that gives you some other sources of information which you need to work on. So from whatever angle you are looking into it, there's always the importance, there's always the notion that having different key stakeholders in this process of providing you with the right information at the right point in time, sometimes even with different viewpoints, is also, I would say, something which is very, very important. Stakeholders could be employees, could be managers, could be suppliers, could be different people at different levels. The most important thing is that you would ensure that whoever is contributing to this don't have their own personal agenda, because if that is the case, all the data, all the information would skew, and therefore the decision will not be the optimal one which the business requires at that particular point in time.
Now, I know you briefly mentioned this earlier. What does the DIKW pyramid represent?
Okay, the DIKW pyramid stands for D for data, I for information, K for knowledge, and W for wisdom. Then you lead to another point, which is decision making. Let us start giving some examples to explain each and every one of these levels of the pyramid. We start with the bottom, which is data. Data is, some people mix up data with information. Let me give an example. Let's say that you have some money to invest in a bank.
Okay.
So you have 100 euros, and there are two banks available, Bank A and Bank B. Bank A gives you 5% rate of interest, which are far more than what we're getting today, and Bank B gives you 10% rate of interest. So right now, you have three very important data sets at hand. You've got 100 euros extra in your pocket. You've got Bank A, which is giving 5% rate of interest, and Bank B, which is giving a 10% rate of interest. Those are different data sets, different data points, which are there in the organization. As I was saying earlier on, these are different data sets which are at different parts of the organization. You can choose to keep this data point separately. If you're going to keep this data point separately, you're not going to get anything out of it. So the next step is to transfer that data to information. And, you know, though the step between data and information is technically and academically different, a lot of people actually look into this as one whole process. Actually, the DIKW Pyramid is all one process. And when we're processing information, we don't say that this is data, this is information, this is knowledge, and this is wisdom. We look into it as one together. But what I'm doing here is I'm processing the information step by step. Okay. So with those three data sets, you go to the next step, which is information. Now, what is the information? That if you invest your 100 euros in Bank A, you have 5% on that amount. And if you're investing it in B, you have a 10%. So now the information is you're putting different data sets together. So now the 100 euros is not seen independently from the 5%, and the 100 euros is not seen independently from the 10%. But with information is getting different data sets together. 5% for 100 euros and 10% for 100 euros, which you got 5 euros and an extra 10 euros. So there you have information. Information which was only gathered, which is only available because there was scientific data sets before. If you go on gut feeling, before we go further on this model, you would say, which is the best bank to invest? Is it Bank A or Bank B? And you keep on supposing, you keep on thinking. Now, I'm giving this very simplistic example on the assumption that everything else is equal. So I'm not including any other endogenous or exogenous variables in the process. So now what have we got, Sandy? We've got the data, we've got the information. Okay. Now, you are knowledgeable. You are more knowledgeable because with the information you have, you know exactly where to put your money. So you know that Bank B is giving you more than actually Bank A. Because the data which has been transcribed to information, which has been processed to information, two different variables together, is giving you some knowledge which you were not aware before. Now, this is a very simple thing, but it could be applied to much more complex situations where complex mathematical algorithms would have to be processed. So now if I would tell you, what is the knowledge that you have available? You would say, very easy, that Bank B is giving me 5 euros more than Bank A. So if you go to the next step, you've got the wisdom. The wisdom is the assurance that you're clever. You're only clever based on what? Based on the data sets which you have provided before, based on how you manipulated those data sets into information, based on how you manipulated that information to suit you, and you've translated that information into knowledge, and based that knowledge into wisdom, and the wisdom is therefore you know exactly where you need to make your decision. Now, this is a very much of a simplified example. But let us now add some variables to that. Let us now add two variables. we could add a behavioral variable, and we could add an economic variable.
Okay.
Let us say that you want to invest somewhere where you have more assurances that notwithstanding that you are getting less, but the investment is much more secure. There are people who are risk averse, there are people who are risk takers. So you could say, I would prefer investing in Bank A because Bank A has been in business for 100 years. It has never failed clients. So though that I'm getting less, but it is secure, which is one of your behavioral attributes that you're giving priority in your model. Bank B, however, has only been set few years, and in few years, notwithstanding that it's giving twice as much in the case of rate of interest, but it has defaulted twice, with its customers. So you say, okay, the risk is much higher, but I'm getting a return for that risk. Your behavioral attribute would condition that information, the wisdom, the knowledge, and the wisdom later on. Let us include another economic variable. And the economic variable is that, for example, some regulatory framework which is conditioning how this money is distributed. It is a hypothetical example, of course. You would say that anything above 7% would have to be reinvested. Now, all of a sudden, the parameters have changed. You still have all that information, all that data that you've started off with, but now you've got more data at play. You still have the 100 euros, you still have Bank A, you still have Bank B, you still have Bank A giving 5%, you still having Bank B giving 10%, but now we're included that whoever is investing is risk averse. Then we're included that whoever is investing is not only risk averse, but want to play safe. We all have more information and data that one bank has been there for 100 years, another bank is there only recently. The first bank has never defaulted, the second bank has defaulted. You've got some other exogenous data, which is that whoever is investing, I repeat, it's a hypothetical example, would have to keep the first 7.5% reinvested in that. So if you are if you are risk averse, then you're increasing your risk because you're also investing your interest back into your original capital. So now all of a sudden, it hasn't remained easy. Yeah. Now all of a sudden, this has become, even though it's still simple, but it has become slightly more complex. Because in the equation, you don't only have things which are hard facts which can be easily lead you to a particular decision, but you've got a behavioral one, which is your approach. Yeah. You have an exogenous variables which are constantly changing. And this is how models are actually built in evidence-based management. Unless you're a genius, it is very difficult to process a number of factors simultaneously and contemporaneously. But even geniuses would need the use of algorithms to do that. Even geniuses would need the use of models in order to do that. Here I've mentioned 4, 5, 6 variables. All start from data, putting them together you have information, going to knowledge, going to wisdom. The human mind, it could be a bit difficult, or rather very difficult, to process all that information and much more in reality into one concept. The same applies, for example, in operations management. Imagine that, you are organizing a wedding and you know how many guests you're inviting. You don't know, however, their preferences for food, so you are assuming. You have a budget, and there are a number of issues at play, and that's only a one-time event. But you may have an operation which is a constant event, I don't know, for example, a restaurant or a hotel, to give the same example, where you're going to have peaks and troughs over a season, over a period of time, depending on the type of tourists that are coming, depending their age group, depending whether they are, I don't know, category A, B, or C tourists, depending if they're coming from Asia, from Europe, from Africa, from the Middle East. Where are they coming from? What culture are they bringing with them? So there are a number of parameters, the parametric models, where these different parameters would all find their particular place in one whole system, which ultimately, when these are put together, you would be able to create what we refer to as a number of what-if scenarios. So even some, from an economic perspective, we used to call this the Bonferroni analysis, a number of what-if scenarios. What if I increase my rate of interest from 5 to 7%? In Bank A? And what if I decrease my rate of interest from 10 to 7.5% in Bank B? That would change the whole thing, provided that everything else being equal. So you would start creating these number of probabilities. You would start creating these number of options. You would start creating these number of ideas. Some of these ideas, some of these options are very hypothetical. But the fact that you are looking into these potential different options hypothetically, but doing it scientifically, at least you have scientific hypothesis, which would then help you to have the necessary wisdom, and through the necessary wisdom, that would lead you to make a decision. This is completely different than when you act on your gut feeling. Where would you like to go to have dinner this evening? Would you like to go in this place or in that place? That is very behavioral, very based on that whim of that particular point in time, and there's no science behind it. But if I would tell you, for example, how stock markets operate, if I would tell you in actually building bridges with a lot of engineering and engineering data, if I would tell you, the investment portfolios of the big banks in for example, in New York or in London, if I would tell you a lot of medicines and surgeries that are taking place and all the different complexities that happens in the medical field, what would you say? So over there, we are not playing with just Bank A and Bank B at 5% and 10%. But we're putting into play a huge number of data, a huge number of variables. Variables which even looking at them on their own merit, it's very difficult to understand, let alone if you're putting all these variables in different contexts. Then again, the contextual framework within which this is built would therefore lead to a particular decision at a later point in time. This is not a question where one variable is more important than the other, because the variables are constantly changing. If there's one thing where evidence-based is becoming even more important than it was some years, it started in the early 1990s. So what? It's not even 20 years, if you really think about it. It must have started around about the 1992s. But having said that, in a very short period of time, it has become extremely important for one particular reason. Because it gives more rationality, talking about the bounded rationality theories, it gives more rationality to your decision-making processes. Before, the decision-making processes, Max Beserman is one of the famous authors for building decision-making models. At that particular point in time, some of the models discussed are also very highly rational. Maybe they were not called evidence-based, so now this is a huge complete development of what we're discussing. But they all lead towards leading a decision for two reasons. One, because the market is constantly changing, and secondly, because it's very uncertain. If you know what was going to happen in the future, you would probably take the right action. Life is interesting, even business life and management is very interesting, because all you can do is plan, anticipate, use all your past knowledge scientifically, and try as much as you can to anticipate all the future needs, all the future endeavors that are bound to happen. I think I've tried in a nutshell to explain what is the data, information, knowledge, and wisdom pyramid.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Kaizen's rule, in which they suggest a 5W and 1H rule. How can this be applied to managerial roles?
Okay, when the Japanese came with the Kaizen method, they initially started their Kaizen approach for quality. And this goes back in the late 1980s. Some people even have traced it before. When the Japanese, particularly when they were going extremely aggressively in the motor industry and giving their manufacturing industry more weight for quality. I'm not going to go into the Asian markets and how quality is measured there, but the Japanese in particular, they differed themselves completely and they gave high importance to their quality control and to their quality measures. As a matter of fact, later on in view of the Kaizen, there's also the Gamba Kaizen now, which is continuous quality improvement. The Kaizen, so it started as a quality control measure, but it evolved, it developed. The principles are very easy. Now, we can go into that much detail as we want, looking into the quality control measures of the Kaizen. But what they did is they constantly asked what, why, where, who, when, and how. Whatever product, whatever service, whatever part of the supply chain, they constantly asked several times the 5 W's and the H, and hopefully they got an answer from each and every one of them. If the answer was not clear and the answer was not insightful, they didn't have the wisdom that that answer was going to lead them to a better part of the process, even in the same supply chain, they would stop, rethink, remeasure, recontrol, rebalance, recalibrate, and start again. So in actual fact, the Kaizen, in order to do that, has put a lot of emphasis on one very simple thing: measuring. At each and every question you ask, there's a measurement. Who? There's a measurement there. So you're identifying a group of people as against another. When? When has a time frame. So the Kaizen has both a stakeholder analysis and a temporal analysis. Now, in the future, in the immediate future, in the medium-term future, in the long-term future. So when? Where? The service, the product, the outcome depends on where that is going to be delivered. I mean, even the way we behave, even you know, the attire we put on. We're here, so we're formal. We go somewhere else, so we're less formal. So they ensure that each and every W is adequately measured. When, where, who, why? And why has a lot of, you know, when you know, as much as I do when we do process mapping, the why leads to a question. And why is it this and not the other? And why if I get 10% and not 5%? And what if I get the 5% with a low rate and the 10% with a low rate or with a high rate? So at each and every point, there was a very critical measure. Throughout the process, they asked these 5 W's and the how at each and every critical phase. And that led them to actually be at the forefront of competition in different industries. Europeans immediately realized this, and the Japanese development of their quality control Kaizen approach was then adopted and adapted positively in Europe and in all part of the Western world, including the US, including the north of Europe, because we've learned one particular thing. That in order to be able to deliver either a finished product or a finished service, it needs to satisfy the client. It primarily needs to satisfy the customer needs, the customer perceptions, and the customer desires. If that final point fails, even if the whole process was excellent, it didn't matter at the end of the day. I mean, you could have produced, I don't know, the best donut. But if that particular donut cannot be sold at the right place at the right time for the right people, probably it would be pointless. So the realization was that throughout the supply chain, throughout this whole process, if everything else holds water, if each and every step we're asking these questions constantly, repetitively, and we should start getting the same answers. If from one part of the process to the other we're getting different answers, we're not having this homogeneity in our answers, then there's something fundamentally wrong. Once you start getting the homogeneity, then there is quality control. Then you're going into a linear part of your process. If you're failing this linear part, you're probably failing the client, the customer at the end of the day. What do customers want? Customers want to meet their expectations, and they want to meet their expectations continuously and consistently. It's like, again, I try to give simple examples. The fast food industry, part of their success were consistency and meeting expectations. We're not talking that that's the best food, we're not talking that it's the best quality food, but this is not the point. The point is that it meets a particular customers, because it is consistent, it is reliable, and it meets their desires at that particular point in time. So if you feel like having one of the fast food products, you know where to go and you know exactly what you're going to get. You may go to a 5-star restaurant and you're still very curious what you're going to get at the end. Would I like it? Would I not like it? I mean, undoubtedly, the skill put in the 5-star is probably much more in terms of culinary competences than the fast food. But these cannot be compared because they are two different streams. Both should have their Kaizen approach, which varies because the customers varies. So it's built around this particular modeling and ways of doing it.
Okay, thank you. Now I'd like to move on to the decision-making process. Could you describe the steps involved?
Okay, there are different decision-making processes. Most of them are similar in their approach. So we're going to quote here a general one with different steps, and from time to time we'll be putting slides to explain exactly these different steps. Actually, if you would allow me, the 6 common steps that are generally applied, as the slide actually shows here, is the first, there need to be recognition that there is a decision.
Okay.
We need to recognize. Let me go through them and then we explain. So first, there's the recognition that there need to be a decision. Secondly, there need to be a process where we need to start generating a series of alternatives. Then we need to evaluate each and every alternative, because it doesn't mean that, you can generate as much as alternatives as you want, but what are the outcomes of each and every one of them? Then you have to choose, you have to implement that decision, and you have to learn from feedback. Let us go one by one now. The first part of the process, of any process, is an understanding that things need to change. Yeah. The first part of the process is actually understanding that I need to do something to move away from my current position to a new position. Every change management process starts in this particular way. The fact that you recognize that you need to make a decision, it's a first step.
The awareness of it. Yeah.
The awareness. It's like a patient, no? Once the patient realizes that he or she needs to pay a visit to the doctor, that's the first step, the awareness, the recognition, the understanding. And these are 3 different words. First is awareness, I reckon. Then there's the understanding. But then there's the cognition. You know that if you're not going to make a decision, this could be catastrophic, for example. If you're not following the doctor's advice, and then you need to make a decision. I need to do something about it. I need to take a step. I need to take a bold step. Sometimes it's too bold, and that's the problem. So that's the first step, which leads to the second step, which is you generate alternatives. Generally, there's not just one way how to do things. And this refers back to what we were discussing earlier on. If you have the pyramid, which we discussed earlier on, the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid, and if you know all the different possibilities, If you carry out a number of what-if scenarios based on that data we spoke about before, the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid, then you will be in a better position to generate a number of possible solutions. Choosing that possible solution comes later. Unfortunately, the inexperienced would try to come up to one solution and then start creating plan B, plan C, and plan D. The rational decision making based on evidence-based management is a bit different. So on the data, information, knowledge, and wisdom that you have, one needs to generate a number of different solutions. And yes, there are different solutions. Yes, there are different possibilities, and each and every possibility varies with the consequences that it brings along. The next step is to make the decision, right? You need to evaluate them, and once you are evaluating them, you need to make a decision. Because generating them is one thing. Evaluating them to actually come to a final decision is completely another. This is like when you're going to buy a pair of shoes, right? There could be 100 pair of shoes that you women like, but ultimately you have to make a decision. Now you can make a decision that you may buy one pair of 100 euros, just to keep to the 100 euros, or you can decide to buy two pairs of 50 euros each. But you still kept constant that 100 euros that you had available to spend. The alternatives are different. You can buy a neutral color, or you can buy a red pair or a blue pair, but that would limit you with what you're going to wear that pair of shoes, I presume.
Most likely, yes.
Most likely, because I'm not a fashion expert, but most likely, yes. So generating that alternatives and then evaluating these alternatives, you say, okay, therefore, what is the best option for me? Because as individuals, and companies are individuals, collective individuals, a decision which is an alternative, which may be a very good decision for one entity, may not necessarily be, it has the same benefits for another entity. And this is also a very critical, important step that we need to understand. Unfortunately, again, the inexperienced may lead themselves to a decision because a similar company actually made the same decision. So they would argue, because that decision was undertaken by that company, then most likely, I'm sure they did their work, so I need to take the same decision. That way may work completely the opposite, because your attributes may not be the same as the previous company. So when you're generating and you're studying the alternatives, which is the third step, it is very important. Then you actually make the decision, which is the fourth step.
Okay.
Therefore, you're firm over your control that this fourth step, you're choosing one alternative over another, is the best for you. Hopefully it will work. And when I say hopefully it will work, because there could also be instances that things may not work. And things may not work, not because you have not made your right homework, but because there have been some changes in the internal or external variabilities. You need to be wise enough that immediately you could have options that you can do to cater for that measure. And this comes to the fifth and the sixth step. The fifth is, once a decision is taken, you cannot remain on the fence. This is like going swimming and you think that the water is too cold, so you still don't have a dip. I mean, if you're going swimming, swim. Ultimately, you need to make a decision and implement it. Some people actually fail because, for example, a decision may have 10 steps. The first 3 steps are the most difficult. And they would retrieve, saying that this is not going to work. Without giving that decision, it's full cycle of implementation. Give it time to work. Give it time to give results. If you know that the particular decision which you have undertaken is spread over, for example, 10 steps, you cannot stop after the 3rd step, because you have not given this decision its full course of implementation. So don't expect that you are going to get the full benefits because you have stopped quarter way or 1/3 through the way. And then it's important to constantly evaluate, to constantly get feedback from the participants, feedback from the stakeholders, your own feedback as well, because your own feedback is massively important because it's giving a lot of knowledge, which will then be part of your wisdom. So this is the collective way of decision making, which ultimately helps, companies in moving forward.
That's great. And for my last question today, Dr. De Bono, is what are the causes of incomplete information and absurd decisions?
Undoubtedly time. One of the main issues which people tell you is there was no time to look into it. Everything seems to be a crisis. Everything seems to be that a decision needs to be taken yesterday. I mean, again, failing to plan is planning to fail. And we need to start understanding that even our role as leaders, as managers in the organization, is also to think. It's also to plan. Saying that there was no time to think is not an excuse. Saying that there were constantly time constraints is not an excuse. But yes, time constraint is one of the big issues. There is also the risk of self-fulfilling prophecy. You know something is going to happen, so you run the risk of not doing it because you are meeting your own self-fulfilling prophecy. So you will not go that way because that is what you think is going to happen. So you will rule out that possibility out of the question as well. That is not scientifically based. That is very much personal based. That goes back to your gut feeling. Risk is another. The risk of not listening to data, but only listening to yourself. Then there's uncertainty. Uncertainty cannot be avoided.
Yeah.
One of the hardest rules for decision making is that because there are a lot of uncertainty, there is a lot of uncertainty internally and externally. Yes. There are a number of variables which create this level of uncertainty in the business constantly. So when the business is full of all these uncertainties, a decision becomes even more difficult. These uncertainties cannot be avoided. Maybe planning for time can be met, avoiding the self-fulfilling prophecy can be met, but uncertainties, cannot. You can anticipate, you can use past data for regression purposes to anticipate the future as much as you can, but you cannot eliminate the uncertainty 100%. Then there's ambiguous information, for example. When you're getting information which is not clear, which is not correct, which is not scientifically proved. I'm sure that there are a lot of others, but these are some of the issues that I think at this particular point in time, which definitely shows that the more uncertainty there is, the more risks there are, the more ambiguity, the more gut personal feeling. The notion of introducing evidence-based management, evidence-based solutions in the business as a whole, in the different functions and in the different processes is not a luxury anymore, but it's a must that managers, that leaders must start understanding. It all starts with gathering data. Yeah. It all starts with gathering scientific hard data. It all starts with translating the data into reliable information. It all starts with then translating that information into knowledge. And with knowledge, we are more wisdom to make decisions.
All right. That's the questions I've got for you today, Dr. De Bono.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time too. So there you have it. Today we spoke about evidence-based management. Our key topics included the definition of evidence-based management and its application. We looked into the DIKW Pyramid, and we ended up with the decision-making process. That's it for today. Thank you, and see you next time.